Okay, so we are going to begin with the heart today, and we are going to move through as much today as we can, but we'll probably have to pick up on next Wednesday to finish the chapter. I just thought it was going to work. There we go. Okay, so basically, where's your heart? Well, it's actually in the center, and the apex points towards the left, okay? So if you look at the way the heart is kind of pointed, it has an apex. And that apex does point towards the left side, and it is because of the heart that we have, our lungs are different. Our left and our right lung are different. And what you're going to see is because of this apex, and it protrudes into the left lung, so our left lung is going to be bilobed. It's only going to have the 2 lobes, where the right lung has the 3. Does everybody see that? But the heart is found, and it works. It needs to be close to the lungs. Anybody have any good reason why the heart and lungs kind of work together? All right, oxygenation. So the very substance that the heart will be transporting will need to be picking up a very special gas called oxygen. It also drops off waste products such as carbon dioxide. So the heart is placed directly in the middle of the lungs, and you can see the apex protrudes into the left side. From looking at the picture, all of the things that you see we're going to know and we're going to understand. You can see the blood work of the heart. We're going to talk about chambers. We're going to talk about serous membranes. Do you remember from A&P1 talking about serous membranes? All right, so if you'll recall, everything has a couple of different types of membranes, right? Double layered, and typically those serous membranes will have a visceral membrane. In this case, we call it the pericardial membrane, so we'll have a visceral pericardium and a parietal pericardium, and that outer membrane typically is an anchoring to the body cavity. Y'all remember that? That's important to remember. That was something we learned in Chapter 1 of A&P1, and that's important because we never stop talking about those membranes. They're super important. And they're usually in between those membranes. There's fluid to prevent friction and be protective. And the example we like to use is a balloon. Y'all remember the balloon example? So if I had a balloon, I think I actually tried to bring y'all a balloon in here, and I had blown it up too big. So you probably remember that more so than the example. But if you blow a balloon up like to where it's not about to pop, and there's a little give in the latex, you can blow it up and you can stick your fist in it. And that balloon is like the membranes around an organ. So we could pretend that the fist was the heart, and then the part of the balloon that directly attaches to the fist would be an example of the visceral pericardial membrane. And then the outer part of the balloon would be like the parietal pericardial membrane. So, and that's the case in almost all of the organs. They're all bilayered membranes like that. Additionally, when we think of the heart, we're thinking of 2 circuits, okay? Basically a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. And the right side of the heart is involved in the pulmonary circuit because all the blood, obviously, first of all, it comes in the heart on the right side at the superior and inferior vena cava, which you can't see the inferior from this picture, but the blood enters the heart here. And then imagine that arrow going all the way back to the back of the heart, and you could see the inferior vena cava. And when we get to lab and we look at an actual sheep heart, I'll let you stick your finger through there and see where all that comes through. You'll be able to see it. But the superior and inferior vena cava dump deoxygenated blood into the right side of the heart, and it's called the right atria. Right atrium. Atria is the plural. Where do you think the blood is going to go from there? All right, there's a ventricle. So the heart is going to be chambered. It's going to have 2 atria and 2 ventricles, and all that's going to be super important. What's your question? Oh, what's your mechanical term? Okay, cool. What's your question? You can't see the inferior vena cava at all. I'm drawing the arrow showing you that it would be behind. If you kept going behind the heart, you'd see it. But do you see how the superior vena cava is blue? So like the inferior vena cava would be blue also. Okay, yeah, you can see it. On page 663, you can see where my arrow was trying to get to. Yes. That's where blood is coming from the lower part of the body, lower extremities. So the superior and inferior vena cava, that's where blood, it's dropped off most of the oxygen to the tissues that it's going to drop off, and now it's going back to pick up more oxygen. So when blood returns to the heart, it has the purpose of getting more oxygen, so it'll be pumped to the lungs. So then it'll be pumped to the lungs. So that's why it's called, the right side of the heart is just considered the pulmonary circuit, because the whole entire goal of the right side of the heart is to go get oxygen. That's the goal. When it leaves the right side of the heart and goes into the lungs, it's picking up oxygen. When we go to the respiratory system, when we get to respiratory system, which will be right after endocrine system, you'll understand that process, exactly how oxygen is dropped off. CO2 is picked up. CO2 is dropped off. How do the lungs do that? They have tiny, tiny, tiny little bitty capillaries all over these little balloon-like structures called alveoli. So you'll learn all about that when we get to respiratory system. So the right side of the heart, entire goal is to get oxygen for the blood. When the blood has become oxygenated and it returns to the heart, it comes in the left side. The left side of the heart, if you'll remember, you see the apex, you see how much it extends into the left side of the lung? That's because this side has to be really super muscular. Anybody want to know why? A lot further to go. So on the right side, all we had to do was get the blood to the lungs, right? Left side has the goal of getting the blood to the whole entire body. Because now, all that oxygenated blood needs to go to the body to drop off the oxygen for your cells, for cellular metabolism. So, that side of the body is called the systemic circuit, because it's basically hitting all the systems. And that's the reason why we call it the systemic circuit. It is located in the mediastinum. If you'll remember back to chapter 1, again, when we talked about the chambers of the body, remember we talked about how the body was divided, the cavities, that was like basic number 1. Well, the mediastinum is one of those cavities, and it's found in the thoracic cavity. Y'all remember that? And the mediastinum houses the heart right in between the lungs, or the pericardial cavity, right? I'm sorry, the pleural cavity. Pleura is lungs, pericardium is heart. The pericardial cavity is in the mediastinum. Okay? The heart is enclosed in a membrane called the pericardium. We have the superficial fibrous pericardium and the deep serous pericardium. So you can see these. So basically, when we dissect our hearts, we may have to get rid of some of this pericardium. It can kind of be a little messy trying to get all that off so that you can see the structures you need to see. But so here we can see, this is a little section of the heart here that we're looking at. This is basically the internal part of the heart here, but here's the heart wall. Look at all this muscle in here. Remember, cardiac muscle is its own type of muscle. And it's got to pump. Boy, if that muscle quits pumping, we're in a lot of trouble. So it's got to pump continuously. And whenever a person has a heart attack, like myocardial infarction, right? When a person has a heart attack, which my preacher just had a heart attack, but he's going to be okay. He just had open heart surgery today. And one of those arteries, and it's often the circumflex artery, becomes clogged, right? When that happens, the muscle dies. because oxygenated blood can't get to the heart muscle, and it has to have a constant supply. So basically, enough muscle dies that causes the heart, to panic, pretty much going into myocardial infarction. And if too much muscle dies, it could be irreparable, and that person may actually die, and that can happen in a heart attack. But whenever that heart muscle dies, you can't get it back. It's not regenerative. You can't. It's not going to. You're not going to be able to do anything to pump it back up and get it back healthy. So we have to keep blood supply to that muscle, and that's what will damage the muscle. So that part of the muscle of the heart is called the myocardium, and myo means what? Muscle. Y'all remember myofibrils? We talked about, y'all remember endomysium, epimysium, the myo in there had to do with muscles. Then we have the epicardium. All right, so that's going to be that visceral membrane I was talking about, the balloon example. So here's the visceral layer there. Y'all see that? And see how it folds like the balloon? What's that? The parietal layer of the serous pericardium. Do y'all see that? All right. And then there's this fibrous membrane on the outside called the fibrous pericardium. So you can see the serous membranes of the pericardium. You can see the fibrous membranes of the pericardium. So important to kind of recognize there's all these extra things for protection of the heart and to allow the heart to be able to do what it needs to do. And of course there's fluid in the pericardial cavity. Remember how I said, so like we were looking at the balloon, there's a cavity in between those membranes and it's fluid filled. And then we talked about the 3 layers. And if you think back to everything that we've talked about in AMP1, there was almost always 3 layers of everything. Y'all remember that? All right, so the heart has 3 layers, and it's almost typically always endo something, myo something, epi something. Endocardium, and usually that middle layer is something muscular. When at the very end of this class, when we start talking about reproductive system, the uterus comes to my mind because you have an endometrium and a myometrium, So it's just a lot of things in anatomy are universal and logical. From time to time, there is logical things. So the heart has the 3 layers, the endocardium being the most internal, the myocardium being the cardiac muscle that we were looking at, and the epicardium. Any questions about that? All right, so now this slide is extremely complicated looking, and that's because I like trying to make these PowerPoints in as few slides as possible. So you have these pictures, okay, in your textbook. These pictures are important. I want you to take the pictures of the heart, and I want you to be able to look at the different views and recognize those different views. So you need to understand an anterior view and a posterior view. And guess what? When we get in lab, you're not only going to need to be able to recognize and tell me, am I looking at the anterior side of the heart or the posterior side of the heart? But you're going to have to be able to label all kinds of things on the heart. So start with these pictures, because basically in not this Monday but next Monday when we come to lab, we'll do a short little thing on blood typing, and then we're going to go all into that heart, okay? So that's important to start now looking at these pictures and studying those pictures. Now, we've already talked about the fact that we have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. There's the right side, and then there's the left side. And the atria and the ventricles are separated by valves. We'll talk about those valves. And the valves prevent backflow. We basically want our blood to flow unidirectionally, right? One direction. If it backwashes, it's not a good thing at all. It totally needs to go in one direction. So we have valves that prevent that. So there's valves that separate the atria from the ventricles, and there's also valves that separate the heart from the outside, systemically and pulmonary. So we'll talk about all of that, and it's basically to prevent backflow. The atria atria being plural form, there are two atria, a left and a right. They're called the receiving chambers. They typically are receiving blood. The ventricles, and they're these lower chambers, they discharge. So they're expelling the blood out. So you've got the atria being receiving, the ventricles discharging, and they do this at the same time. All right? They are separated by the interatrial septum and interventricular septum. So there's a septum in the middle. It totally separates these chambers. The interatrial septum basically separates the atria, and the interventricular septum portion separates the ventricles. On the surface, you can identify the coronary sulcus, and then that's how you can find the interventricular sulci. So, and you can basically see that here's the anteriorly looking at the heart. And there's that circumflex artery. Remember what I was just telling you about? That one is real common to get clogged. All right, so you can see the circumflex artery here. Probably should use the pen so that you can see that. So here's that circumflex artery here. That one is real common to get clogged up and cause a heart attack. All right, and then over here is your right coronary artery. You can't see it because it's red. Okay, let me go ahead and denote something else so that you know the difference between an artery and a vein. Somebody tell me what an artery and a vein is. Yes. So arteries are defined in that they're leaving away. So blood is going away. Veins are going towards the heart. So veins are leading towards the heart. And basically, there are capillary beds where gas exchange occurs that connect arteries to veins. So with that, arteries typically, there's only one exception, but arteries, all arteries except for one, carry oxygenated blood. Yes. Interatrial. It's basically all the same septum. Right. It's basically like this goes all the way on up and it's cut off here. So, but it would separate, yeah. But it separates. Yes. Well, it depends. It depends on how you cut it. Whenever we take a practical on an actual organ, I will actually find the very best organ that I think is the most, or the best example for you to be tested on, and then I'll show you on the actual organ, these are things I want you to know. Yes. No, the only exception to an artery, see, all arteries carry oxygenated blood except the pulmonary artery, because it's carrying it to the lungs to get oxygen. Yeah, there's various sizes. All arteries, like when we go in blood vessels in chapter 19, we'll talk about all the different types of arteries, and they all have they have differing levels of muscle, it depends. But we will learn the differences between different types of arteries. Yes. Yes, and there are differences between veins and arteries. And we will distinguish between an artery and a vein in lab. I'll give you a model and I'll show you some very specific differences. And we can look in a microscope and distinguish the difference between an artery and a vein. So they're very different in their structure. They do have some similarities. So we could compare and contrast if we wanted to for fun, an artery and a vein. But and we'll talk about that in chapter 19. But it is very important that you understand that all arteries are oxygenated except for the pulmonary artery. And guess what? All veins are deoxygenated except for the pulmonary vein. Because guess what just happened? It went and got some oxygen and it's got to go back to the heart. So anything that leads to the heart is a vein. Anything that leads away from the heart is an artery. There are no exceptions. But for the oxygenation part, there's the one exception. And if you actually don't have to memorize that, you just need to, and you're going to have to know the pathway of blood. So you just need to know what's happening to the blood. It's going where to get oxygenated. So if you know that that's an artery, you'll know that that's not supposed to have oxygenated blood till it gets it from the lungs. You see what I'm saying? I would rather you be able to think through something than to memorize something. I want you to be able to think. So it is important to be able to distinguish between an artery and a vein and what's happening. So definitionally as well. Yes, Gerald? Oh yeah, there's a slide up here that goes through the whole thing about blood flow. And we're going to go through that. We're going to track blood flow through the heart. And it's really easy. It's not super hard. But you'll need to know and be able to track blood flow through the heart for the lecture and the lab. In lab, I'll pins and stuff. I might even give you a question that says, put these structures in order of blood flow. And that might be 5 questions. So that's what I would call an overall concept of cardiovascular system, knowing blood flow, right? At the very least, when you walk out of these doors, you better know how blood flows, all right? So that's kind of important. So going back to, and I'm going to try to use the black pen. So here's our, let me erase. We found the circumflex artery. That one often gets clogged and causes heart attack. Coming off, it also comes off of this, this is called the left coronary artery. Remember, the left side of the heart is where it protrudes into the lung and has the apex. So we found the apex here. We're looking at an anterior view. And that's one of the things you got to do. You got to say, okay, I'm looking at an anterior view. Where's the apex? It's going to be pointing left. So it points to the left lung. Well, if you're looking at it directly, it's going to be your right. But if it was in your chest, it would be to the left. So recognize that as well. So basically, left coronary artery. Then you have a vein that lines up with it called the great cardiac vein that you can see here lined up with it. The artery that we just came off of, the left coronary artery, has a branch on it at the very tip called the interventricular artery here. All right? But basically, the left coronary artery is what the circumflex branch is kind of off of. And also, you can see the great cardiac vein clearly. Everybody see that? That's just to help you so that you can identify those arteries and veins and from an anterior view. All right, and then also looking out at the outside of the heart, we see the atria. They have these auricles structures you can see to basically, it allows them to fill up with the blood. So they have a little expansion on them. All right, here's our right coronary artery. So we have basically a left and a right. So here's the right that you can see. And there's branches coming off of that. Here's your anterior cardiac vein that lines with it. So the anterior cardiac vein lines up with that. Also, here is the little artery coming at the bottom is called the right marginal artery. So there's the right marginal artery. And lining up with it, you're going to see the small cardiac vein down here. So marginal. I'm not using the mouse. I'm drawing with the black marker up here. See that? So I don't even know if they have any more colors actually. let's see. Yeah, there's the highlighter. I can highlight, but say that again. The lungs take the lungs. Are you asking me how oxygen goes from the lungs to the blood? See, that's a respiratory system. And we're going to go into a lot of detail about that. But the lungs are full of these little balloons called alveoli, and they're just like, they're tiny, tiny, tiny structures, and they're covered with capillaries. Covered. Just tons and tons of capillaries. And they really are like little balloons because they're stretchy, and that's how people get lung disease. The stretchiness is messed up. The cells die. The stretchiness, they kind of just hang and they don't stretch anymore. And so they can't be taught and receive lots of blood. So those people that have lung disease like that, you hear them like trying to gasp for air because they're just enough blood is not being pumped around the lungs to get oxygen, to pick up enough oxygen for the body. But they have those little structures and they're just covered in capillaries, and those little balloons, they have tons of oxygen. And the oxygen just drops off. It diffuses into the blood. And the carbon dioxide diffuses back into the lungs. And so you expel the carbon dioxide. Does that make sense? All right. So back to what we were looking at. This is the highlighter. Here's the pen. Let's see. Would the orange show up? What color would show up for y'all? Let's try the green. Alright, let's see what happens. Can you see the green? Alright, we're in business. Okay, so what we looked at, there's a right coronary artery and there's a left one, right? Here's the left one. The circumflex comes off of the left one. And then down towards the bottom is the anterior interventricular artery here. And that's going to be kind of easy to remember because that's where the ventricles are, at the lower part of the heart. Also important to recognize is that the great cardiac vein runs along this. So you can see the great cardiac vein right there. You'll see that running along. Then we have, we saw the right coronary artery. There is veins that run with those as well. And we can see the anterior cardiac vein here. And this is, at the very bottom, is the right marginal artery that runs with the small cardiac vein. So those are the arteries and veins that we've looked at so far. Now, here's an atrium. So there's the right atrium, left atrium. It has a little structure called an auricle. It's a little flap, basically, and it allows for expansion of the atria. Now, also worth noting, the superior and inferior vena cava, which is where blood enters the heart. Deoxygenated blood enters here. Y'all see that? Once it goes through the atria, it pumps to the ventricle. It's going to pump out to the lungs, and it's going to pump out through the pulmonary arteries. But they're going to be confusing because they're going to be blue. Why are they going to be blue? Because they're not oxygenated, and typically they're not things are blue when they're not oxygenated. They're red when they are. Also to note is the aorta, which is here, and it has these three branches coming off, which is the left common carotid artery, the brachiocephalic trunk, going to the left and right sides of the body to send out oxygenated blood. The aorta is a real thick, muscular, huge artery because it wraps on down and goes on down and pumps to the rest of the body. So it's feeding the whole entire lower extremities and the rest of the body that's not fed by these areas up here. Okay? So you're going to also note the pulmonary veins, and they're red, which is weird, right? But they're red because they contain oxygen. So today we'll stop right there.